Now, who better to discuss the year in politics in 2023 than the Spectator's chairman, Andrew Neil, who joins us now, along with the Spectator's columnist, the great Rod Liddle. Hello to you both. Thank you.
Hello. Happy Christmas, Freddie.
Merry Christmas.
Happy Christmas to you both. Andrew, I'll start with you. Let's start with the recent and at home. Rishi Sunak's Rwanda bill passed last night in the House of Commons. But it's a bit of a sorry state for the Tory party, is it not? When this was seen as a victory for Sunak. And actually it was just the avoiding of a huge defeat, was it not?
I think I'll file sorry state under a British understatement, I think. Yes, he does live to fight another day by winning the vote. Shock horror, government with majority of 80 wins vote. But it doesn't change very much. I mean, the dominant feature of British politics in 2023 has been the failure of the Conservatives in general and Mr. Sunak in particular to move the dial. That Labour lead of around 20 points just stays solid. It doesn't matter what the Tories do. They try a relaunch in the summer. They try a new pitch at their conference. They have an autumn statement. They try to put more life into the illegal boats, into the boat people policy. None of it moves the dial. It is almost the exact opposite of what happened when John Major took over from Margaret Thatcher in 1990. When John Major took over, of course, there hadn't been musical chairs of leadership. She'd been there for 11 years. She was by then unpopular. But John Major for a while saw an uplift in the polls for the Tories. It moved the dial. This time it hasn't. And I think that Mr. Sunak is haunted by the fact that he's not a new leader that's taken over from a long-standing leader. He's a new leader that's taken over from David Cameron, Theresa May, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss. And with all that game of musical chairs, it would seem to me that the Tory credibility is shot to hell, and things won't be any different next year either.
And Andrew, I mean, at the beginning of the year, I remember Tories talking quite a lot about Sunak still having a narrow path to victory at the next general election. Do you think that path is now non-existent?
It's close to non-existent. I mean, I'm always reluctant to say never, because we do live in a very febrile political age, and things can change very quickly. I look at America, far from Donald Trump being under pressure now in Iowa, his lead is increasing in Iowa, and he'll romp home in the Iowa caucuses on January the 15th. So we live in a time when suddenly it can all just go helter-skelter. But sitting here with the knowledge we have now, again, the news as we record this of the British economy actually declining in October. There's no sense of economic momentum. There's no sign of living standards returning to growth. Inflation, for some curious reason, is more stubbornly high here than it is in any other major economy. So again, I don't see what happens that moves the dial. And if I was to really come down to one thing, I would say it is in the end this, other than this absurd game of musical chairs that the Tories have been treating the country to. I regard Rishi Sunak as a decent man, a competent man, a bit technocratic, but nevertheless a patriot, has the best interests of the country at heart, works very, very hard. But for some reason, he just doesn't have that X factor, that leadership quality that allows you to build a return. And instead, it's really what Jim Callaghan said in 1979 when he was beaten by Margaret Thatcher. He was told in the run-up to the election, hey, Jim, there is still a pathway to victory for you. And he basically said, no, there comes a time when it's over. The country's made up its mind and the other lot should be given a chance. And for good or ill, I think that's exactly where we are now.
Well, Rod, I suppose thank God for Britain and the British left that they have the hugely charismatic Keir Starmer leading the Labour Party to a general election victory next year.
Yeah, I mean, Andrew summed it up beautifully, I think. I mean, it is very similar to what we were saying this time last year. Nothing has changed very much. I mean, and what was implied in what Andrew was saying was nobody voted for Rishi Sunak. The British people didn't vote for Rishi Sunak. The British people didn't vote for Liz Truss. The British people didn't vote for Theresa May. And there's this immense weariness with the Conservative Party, which will not go away, and there is nothing you can do to move the dial on that. There was one suspicion that perhaps if inflation came down and wages began to rise a little bit, which is always a difficult paradox to pull off, that perhaps the position would be better for the Conservative Party. But there is also the feeling amongst those who, particularly up here, that there's been a sort of palace coup. While there's no great love left for Boris Johnson, the people up here who voted overwhelmingly for the Conservative Party in 2019 now see that the Conservative Party is back on its usual liberal Remainer trajectory and want to have nothing to do with it. It's very odd because it seems that nobody actually at all in any of the parties, apart from mine, obviously, wants to have anything to do with the Red Wall voters. Because Sir Keir Starmer doesn't appeal to them very much either. So there's all of that. As for the left, there's a slight hope. There's a slight hope that for the Tories that something ghastly will happen to the Labour Party as a consequence of the Israel-Gaza crisis, where we have seen Starmer under serious pressure. And there are a number of seats in the country which are extremely problematic for the Labour Party if it wishes to win an overall majority, which are either Muslim majority, a couple of them, I think it's Bradford East, or it might be Bradford West, and Birmingham Hall Green, and there's another 30 or 40 where the Muslim vote is decisive. And whilst 62% of Muslims at the last election voted en masse for the Labour Party, that was the last figure I saw was down to 8%. I mean, that is enormous. And you can imagine the chaos for Labour if genial George Galloway decides to take up the battle with Respect and fight in these seats and put candidates up for Respect in the various other seats where the Muslims are a large proportion of the vote. And we'll see a bit of that, I think, in the London mayoral election, where I think Galloway may stand himself. So it's all very interesting. The problem there electorally is that actually, as newspaper proprietors and editors well know, the Israel-Gaza crisis bores the British public into submission, much as did Russia and Ukraine. That's why it's dropped down from the headlines a little bit, because actually it doesn't have a great resonance with the voter, with the reader or the viewer, that this isn't a story which particularly grabs hold of them. What grabs hold of them is immigration, it is the cost of living, and it is inflation. But foreign affairs never tends to impinge that much.
I mean, I think the other big political theme, it's almost the mirror image of the theme of the Tories being unable to move the dial, is that it's clear the country's out of love with the Tories. There's no question about that. It's over as far as the country is concerned. But it's not gagging for Keir Starmer. They're not desperate to say, oh, if only Keir Starmer was in 10 Downing Street. They don't feel that way at all. The way they did for Tony Blair in 96 leading up to 97, which is why I still have some doubts that there'll be a huge Labour majority. I mean, there'll be a comfortable Labour majority and big enough for 5 years if they want to go for 5. But it won't be a Blairite type landslide. On the other hand, they're not frightened of Keir Starmer the way they were a bit frightened of Neil Kinnock in 87 and 92. They were frightened a little bit or just didn't rate Ed Miliband in 2015. They were definitely frightened, particularly up in the Red Wall, of Jeremy Corbyn. They're not frightened of Keir Starmer like that. They see him as a relative safe pair of hands. Rod mentioned the cost of living, which of course domestically has been by far the most important political issue. And the news, I've just come back from the States, the news from America there is dire for the Tories. And the reason I say that is this. The American economy is in far better shape than the British economy. Unemployment's at record lows. Growth in the third quarter was an annual rate of 4%. Living standards are rising again. Interest rates are coming down. Inflation is down to about 3%. It's a pretty rosy economic scenario. And the Biden administration is getting no credit whatsoever. And the reason for that is the cost of living. Because although inflation is down, prices are still a lot higher than they were. And they've risen by a lot more than wages. So people still feel bitter about the cost of living. Now, put that into a British context, where the economy is essentially stagnating, unlike America, and the cost of living crisis is still working its way through. And I think you look at 2024, and if what's playing out in America and harming the Biden administration is going to play out in Britain and harm the Sunak administration, which has a much worse economic tale to tell anyway.
I think that's right. It's quite interesting. I was looking at the figures. In a way, this reminds me, and Andrew alluded to this, that there isn't the same degree of fervour for. I'm just trying to imagine anyone being fervent for Sir Keir Starmer, right? It just doesn't really work, does it? There's not the same fervour for Sir Keir Starmer that there was for Tony Blair. In a way, it reminds me a little bit of the 1964 general election, where you had a Conservative Party that had been in power for 13 years, I suppose, 13 years.
Yes.
With a multiplicity of leaders, with Churchill, Eden, Macmillan, Douglas, Hume, and a public which was sick of them. And I was reading David Kynaston's book about 62 to 65 in Great Britain, which was the time when we built all these horrible shopping centres and so on. And the thing which bleeds through from that is how within the Conservative Party they simply couldn't. They couldn't shift the dial at all. The public had registered a weariness, and that weariness wasn't going to go away. And at the time, they weren't expecting Harold Wilson particularly to be the next prime minister. It didn't really matter. It was whoever Labour had who wasn't actually, mentally impaired. So it all reminds me a little bit of that.
But if, as seems almost inevitable, as discussed, that we are heading towards Britain having a centre-left, I think we can call Labour a centre-left party now, a centre-left government, Britain would then be bucking the trend that we've seen in 2023, would it not, Andrew, of, you mentioned Trump earlier, who seems to be now the bookies' favourite to win the presidential election next year. We'll see about that. But, we have Javier Milei in Argentina, we have Geert Wilders in Holland, we have the European elections coming up next year in June, where the right are supposed to sweep the board. The drift of global politics is going right quite sharply, is it not?
Yes, it is. And to that extent, Britain is out of kilter. I think actually Keir Starmer realises that, which is why he's moved Labour much more to the centre than I ever thought he would. I mean, when I interviewed him for the leadership race, way back just before the pandemic in early 2020, I mean, he campaigned and won the leadership on a Corbynite manifesto. He had 10 pledges, all of which came from the Labour manifesto of 2019. We knew he would resolve from that over time, but I never thought he would go so far. And then suddenly we have a Labour conference in which the Union flag is flown proudly. They sing the national anthem, God Save the King. We're going to be fiscally conservative, but we will protect defence spending. The defence of the realm, allies with the United States, all of that is now part of the Labour mantra. And I think that is a kind of recognition that although the country, we are out of the global political cycle and the people are fed up with the Tories, he knows, as I say, they're not gagging for him or for Labour, and that he cannot afford to be very far from the centre left. I mean, Rod's been writing with this and will tell us more, but we keep on thinking, and it's wishful thinking for a number of the media, that the populist revolt is coming to an end. And every time it's like, Every 3 years, The Economist magazine identifies an African success story. And,
That's right.
and within 3 weeks of that article being published, there's been a coup. I mean, people are being slaughtered in the street. And it's back to poverty and penury. And the forces, look, the Spectator had a very good article. I don't necessarily disagree with it at all. Le Pen could be the next president of France. As things stand at the moment, she'd probably have to be a favourite. The second biggest party in Germany is now the AfD. Italy has a populist prime minister. The Sweden Democrats, not the Social Democrats, the Sweden Democrats are now playing a role in Sweden's government. So you see all of that beginning to happen, and that is before another recession comes in. And of course, we have the resurgence of Donald Trump. No matter how many lawsuits are thrown at him, he just seems to go from strength to strength. The Wall Street Journal poll, which ends the year, shows him now 4 or 5 points ahead of Mr. Biden. And in 5 out of the 6 swing states, Wisconsin being the odd man out, he's ahead in 5 out of the 6 states that will determine the election. Populism has not gone away. And I think Rod is better qualified to explain that than I am.
Well, Rod,
and Andrew's absolutely right. I mean, it hasn't really not gone away. It's simply coming to fruition and has been doing so for a period of around about 12 to 13 years, but perhaps even longer when you remember Pim Fortuyn in the Netherlands back in the early 2000s and Vlaams Blok, people like that. I'd take issue as to whether it's simply a right-wing movement. When you look at, for example, one of the most recent victories, which was that of Robert, I can't remember how you pronounce his surname. Fico is how you pronounce it if he was Italian, but he isn't, he's Slovakian. Feature, perhaps. That's the Social Democratic Party, and it's redistributive, but it's also very, very hardline on immigration, on Islam, and on the various cultural identitarian issues, such
like
as
the Danish centre left too.
No, exactly, and there are plenty of these parties around. When you look at Europe and you're saying it's the end of populism, and Geert Wilders tops the poll in the Netherlands, and the Swiss decide that they've had enough as well. It's a revolt against neoliberalism, and that's very difficult for Keir Starmer to deal with. It's also obviously difficult for Rishi Sunak to deal with because they're both birds of the same feather when it comes to that particular ideology, and which is why there is some hunger for people like Farage, who, despite being basically a Thatcherite economically, which is certainly what he would claim to be, he still takes a tough line on the social issues, which are the things which are annoying an awful lot of people in Europe. I mean, he is a Thatcherite, isn't he? I mean, I don't think there's much getting away from that. Well, the other thing, I mean, which is quite interesting, is when you look at the opinion polls for the 2019 election up here in the Red Wall seats, there was no great aversion up here to the economic policies which John McDonnell was suggesting would be in the Labour manifesto, which was basically left-wing populism and taxing the rich and so on, inheritance tax, etc., etc., etc. The objection was always to their lack of patriotism and to the idiotic foreign alignments that Jeremy Corbyn had, whether it be with Hamas, Venezuela, Cuba, etc. So it's an anti-neoliberal thing.
Yes,
I think that is what is driving it, and it may be even in New Zealand, that strange hermit kingdom of New Zealand, and it may well be that this often happens. We are out of step with the rest of Europe, partly because of our first past the post system, which is looking increasingly anachronistic. But when it comes to the next election, I suspect it will still be a neoliberal government which wins.
I think Rod's right. A lot of the media commentary, which is based on populism equals right wing, a particular hard right view of the world, motivated above all by anti-immigration, that's a very unsophisticated analysis. The fact is, it alludes to what Rod was saying, if you look at the economic policies of Madame Le Pen in France,
yes,
and the economic policies of Mélenchon, Mr. Mélenchon, the sort of Jeremy Corbyn of France, there's not that much difference. They both want a big state. They both want state control of industry. They both want a massive increase in the minimum wage. They are both protectionists. They're both anti-Euro. They are very much against neoliberal economics and so on. So there is a left and a right-wing populism comes together here, and that needs to be appreciated more, because otherwise it's just too easy to dismiss. So it's just a bunch of right-wing nutters. It's much deeper than that.
Amazing to think, isn't it, that Nicola Sturgeon was still First Minister of Scotland at the beginning of this year. It feels like
as I said, we're in febrile times. All predictions can quickly be unfounded.